My mother lived but a few months after that flight of ours, but at least she knew before she died that Bertha was safe. What the old nurse had foreseen had come to pass. The half-Danish and Danish folk of the East Angles owned Sweyn as king, though not willingly, and a housecarl from Wormingford made his way to us with word from Gunhild that set our minds at rest. Truly our hall and Osgods had been burnt by parties from the Danish host, and for a time the danger was great, for Sweyn's vengeance for his sister's death was terrible. Now the land was poorer, but in peace. Yet Hertha would keep in hiding till we might see how things went, for the Danes might be forced back, and when a Danish host retreats it hinders pursuit by leaving a desert in its wake. Many a long year will it be before those Danish pathways are lost to sight again. They seem to be across every shire of our land. So I lived on in Ethelred's court, now in one town and now in another, as the long struggle bade us shift either to follow or fly the Danes, and presently the memory both of my mother and Hertha grew dim, for wartime and new scenes age and harden a youth very quickly. Soon I might ride at the side of Edmund the Atheling to try to stay the march of Sweyn through England, and many were the fights I saw with him, until I was the only one left of all the youths who had been my comrades at first, and Edmund had won his name of Ironside in bravest hopeless struggle. I grew to be a close and trusted friend of his, and so at last amidst the trouble that was all round us in those heavy times the remembrance of Hertha became but as part of a childhood that was long gone, and I thought of her but as of the little one with whom I had played in the old days beside the quiet Stour. There were none left to remind me of her, for one by one my few bears men had fallen, and Edred, who had been my servant at the court, gave his life for mine in my first battle. Into Sweyn's East Anglia our levies never made their way. What need for me to say aught of those 3 years of warfare? Their tale is written in fire over all the fair face of England. For nothing checked Sweyn Forkbeard until step by step the Danish hosts closed on London, and at last even the brave citizens were forced to yield to him. Then Ethelred our king must needs fly from his throne, and leave the land to its Danish master. Yet it was true, as Edmund the Atheling said, that the Dane was but master of the land, and not of the English people. Even today my mind is full of wondering honor for those sullen Saxon levies of ours who for 3 years bore defeat after defeat at the hands of the trained and hardened veterans of the north, uncomplaining and unbent. What wonder if at last we were wearied out and must hold our hands for a while? So now when I was 19, and looking and feeling many years older by reason of the long stress of warfare and trouble, I was at Rouen, in Normandy, at the court of our queen's brother, Richard the Duke. To him Ethelred had fled at the last, and there, too, were the queen and the Athelings, good Abbot Elfric of Peterborough, and a few more of the court, besides myself. Ethelred had hoped to gain some help from the Duke, but he could only give us shelter in our need, for he had even yet to hold the land that Rolf, his forefather, had won against his neighbors, and could spare us not one of his warriors. So in Rouen we waited and watched for some new turn of things that might give us fresh hopes of regaining our own land. Yet it was a weary waiting for one knew not what, and Ethelred the king grew moody and despairing as the days went on, and there seemed to be no help. But Edmund was ever planning for return, and was restless, riding down to each ship that came into the river to hear what news might be, until the winter set in, and we must needs wait until springtime brought the traders again from the English shores. Only Elfgiva the queen, whom her own people call Emma, was well content to be in her own land again for a while, though one might easily see that she sorely grieved for the loss of her state as the Queen of England. And Edward the Atheling loved to be among the wondrous buildings of the Norman land, spending long hours with the learned men, and planning many good things to be wrought in England when times of peace should come once more. And in these plannings Elfric the abbot was ever ready to help him, and the more, as I think, that to hear of their thoughts of return to England, and of happier times, would cheer our king. For Elfric would never allow but that we were here for a short while only, saying that England would yet rise up refreshed, and sweep the Danes into the sea, from whence they came. Else why should I have given all that I have, even £500 for St. Florentin his body, wanting the head, in truth, but I might not have that, if I were not sure that I should take it home for the greater glory of St. Peter's Church at Mead Hampstead, for, presently? Answer me that, Lord King, and be not so downhearted. This he said one day, being full of his purchase, and I think that the cheerfulness of the good man helped our king. Verily, Redwald, my son, the abbot said to me, if I get not St. Florentine home, I think my money is not lost. The king waxes more hopeful when he sees the shrine waiting to be taken overseas. Nor could I say for myself that I was not pleased with the stay in Rouen. For I had never known the fierce joy of victory, and the rest from the long tale of defeat was good to me. Yet I set myself to learn all that I could of the splendid weaponcraft of the Norman warriors, for I thought that I should yet need in England all I could learn. And the new life and scenes pleased me well, for I was young enough to let the cares of our poor land slip from my mind for a while. So the long winter wore away, and at last the season came when we might look for the first ships of the year, and with them news from England. Then Edmund would go to the haven at the mouth of the great river Seine that runs to Rouen, so that he should be at hand to hear the first tidings that came. Glad enough was I to go with him, and we took up our quarters in a great house that belonged to the Duke at the town they call the Haven, and there waited, ever watching the long grey sea line for a coming sail. But none came until the first week in March, when the wind blew steadily from the northeast, and the sky was clear and bright with promise of open weather. Then at last we saw 8 ships together heading for the haven, and that sight was more welcome than I can say. When they came near we knew that they were no traders, but long dragon ships, and at first we thought they were Danish Vikings, and the townsmen armed in haste and mustered along the wharves to prevent their landing, if they came on their wonted errand of plunder. And eagerly enough did Edmund and I join them, only hoping for another blow at our foes, and having no thought in our minds that the ships we watched were bringing us more hope than we dared long for. Next I knew that these ships were like no Danish vessels that I had ever seen, but were far more handsome, both in build and fittings. Nor did they fly the terrible raven banner as most Danes were wont. Then it was not long before the lines of armed townsmen broke up their ranks and crowded down to the wharves to greet the ships in all friendliness, for they were Norse, as it would seem, and the Norse Viking is ever welcome in the land that Rolfganger, the Viking, won for himself. So the ships came into the harbor, brave with gilded dragon heads and sails striped with bright colors, all fresh from their winter quarters, and Edmund turned away, for he thought that they would be Sweyn's men, of the host of Thorkel the Norseman, his great captain, and foster father of Nut his son. For Sweyn held Norway as well as Denmark, and many Norsemen followed him. Thorkel's host was that which slew Elfia, the good Archbishop of Canterbury, whom his monks called Elfige, but last year. That, too, was the thought of the seamen to whom I spoke when the ships were yet distant, and so we went back to the hall heavy and disappointed. We would not speak to these men, knowing that from Thorkel's folk we should but hear boasting of Sweyn's victories. But presently the steward came into the hall, where we sat silently listening to the shouts of the men as they berthed the ships, and he said that the leader of the Vikings would see and speak with Edmund himself. Is he Thorkel, or Thorkel's man? Answered the atheling, for if he be, I will not see him. No, lord, said the steward, he is one who has no dealings with the Danes. He will not tell me his name, but I think that he is a great man of some kind. Not a great man, but thick, said a kindly voice of one who stood without. If hatred of Danes will pass me into Edmund's presence, I may surely enter. And then there came into the doorway a man who was worth more than a second look. Never had I seen one to whom the name of king seemed to belong so well by right as to this man, whatever his rank might be. He stood and looked round for a moment, as if the dim light from the high windows was not enough to show him where we were at first, and I could not take my eyes from him. He was not tall, but very square of shoulder and deep of chest, with mighty arms that were bare, save for their heavy gold bracelets, below the sleeves of his ring mail, and his hair and beard were golden red and very long. He wore a silvered helm, whereon was inlaid a golden cross above a narrow gold circlet that was round its rim, and his hand rested on the hilt of such a priceless sword as is told of in the old tales of the heroes. But I forgot all these things as I looked into his pleasant weather-beaten face, and saw the kindly look in the grey eyes that I knew would flash most terribly in fight. He was 25 years old, as I thought, but therein I was wrong, for he was just my own age, though looking so much older. "I am Olaf Haraldsson Olaf Digri, the Thick, as men call me," he said. "Some call me king, though I rule but over a few ships, as a sea king. Which of you thanes is Edmund the Atheling?" Then Edmund rose up from his place, and went towards the king. His seat had been in shadow, else there had been no need to ask which was he. "I have heard of you, King Olaf," he said, "for your deeds are sung in our land already. And you are most welcome. Have you news from England?" So those two grasped each other's hands, and I think there were no two other such men living at that time. It was good to see them together. "I," said the king, "I have been in England, and therefore I have come to find you. Sweyn is dead, and your chance has come. Let me help you to win your land again." That was plain speaking, and for the moment Edmund held his breath, and could not speak for sheer surprise and gladness. But I could not forbear leaping up and shouting, tossing my helm in the air as I did so wondrous was all this to me, and so full of hope. At that Olaf laughed, and leaving Edmund to his thoughts, turned to me. "Which of the Athelings are you?" he asked. I have heard of Edmund's brothers, and he held out his strong hand to take mine. "I am but the Atheling's comrade, his servant, rather," I said, growing red as I did so, for I had surely forgotten myself in my gladness. "Redwald is no servant, King Olaf," said Edmund quickly. "He is my closest comrade here, and has fought well at my side. Thane of Bears in East Anglia he is, but now the Danes hold his place." "Why then," said Olaf, "Thorolf's grandson surely." "King," I answered, wondering, "my grandfather was named Thorolf. He was one of Olaf Tryggvason's chiefs." "Then have I found a cousin," laughed the king. "Give me your hand, kinsman," and he looked me over from head to foot, but very kindly. I took the king's hand gladly, but somewhat dazed in my mind at being thus owned. And Olaf saw that I was so, and told me more. "Asta, my good mother, was this Thorolf's cousin, and we Norsemen do not lose count of our kin. So I knew well that Thorolf found an English home and wife when Olaf Tryggvason was first in England, and that he was Thane of Bears by some right of his lady. So I knew, when I heard your name and place, that I had found a kinsman. And I have so few that I am glad." Now I knew that this was true, but we had never thought much of Thorolf, rather priding ourselves on his wife's long descent from King Redwald. I wished for the first time now that I knew more of this Norse grandfather of mine. "Presently we will find Ronny, my foster father, who is with the ships," said Olaf. He knew Thorolf well. "You and I must see much of one another, cousin." Then he turned to Edmund, who was, as it seemed, well pleased that I had found so good a friend. And he said, "Forgive me if I have forgotten greater matters for a moment. But I cannot greet a kinsman coldly, and it is in my mind that Redwald is a cousin worth finding, if I may judge by the way in which he hailed my news." "Truly," said Edmund, "I am minded to do as he did, now that I have taken all the wonder of it in. But it seems over good to be true Sweyn dead and your offered help." Then they both laughed, well content, and so Edmund called the steward, and wine and meat were set for the king, and they sat down and talked, as he ate with a sailor's hunger. But I listened not to their talk, my mind being overfull of this good fortune of my own. I had none left of my own kin, and till today I had been as it were alone. Presently, however, I heard an East Anglian name that was dear to me. Edmund asked how it was that Sweyn Forkbeard had died, for none thought that his end was yet to be thought of as near. Now it would seem that he had gone suddenly. "He was at Gainsborough," said Olaf, "and he was about to make his way south to Edmundsburg." Whereon men say that to save his town and shrine the holy martyr, King Edmund, whom Ingvar slew, thrust Sweyn through with an iron lance. Some say that he slew him otherwise, but all agree as to his slayer. And now I think that England will rise. What of Nut, Sweyn's son? Asked Edmund. He is but a boy. What he may be in a few years' time I know not. With him it will be as with myself. I was given a ship when I was 12 years old, and thereafter all that my men did goes to my credit in the mouths of the skalds. Yet my men and I know well that Ronnie, my foster father, whom you will soon know, was the real captain and leader for the first 3 or 4 years. Then said Edmund, Nut is of no account. Olaf laughed a little, and answered, Nut's own arm may be of little strength, but his name is on the lips of every Dane. There are 3 chiefs who will hold the kingdom in his name, and they are the men whom you must meet: Thorkel the High, his foster-father, Ulf Sprakelexen the Jarl, his brother-in-law, and Eirik the Jarl, whose brother Homing holds London even now. Good men and loyal they are, and what they do not does. I have 3 chiefs in my mind who can match these, said our atheling. Olaf the king, and Ulfketel of East Anglia, and Edric Strione, my foster-father. Then Olaf looked in the face of Edmund, as it seemed to me in surprise, and made no answer. Are we not equal then? Asked the atheling. I have heard that Edric Strione is on the Danish side, said Olaf. Cannot Eudred of Northumbria be trusted? Edric has but sought rest, from need, answered Edmund. I know not what else he could do at last. He will join us again as soon as we land. So also will Eudred. Then we are equal, said the king, while a cloud seemed to pass from his face, for Strione led all Mercia, and were he in truth on our side things would go well. It was no very secret talk among some of us that Edric the Earl had made peace sooner than might have been, but that angered Edmund and the king sorely if so much were even hinted. Then you will indeed help us, said Edmund, for Olaf had accepted the place he had named for him as it were. I have a debt to England that I can never repay, answered the king gravely. She gave us our first teachers in the Christian faith. And Sweyn has held Norway, my own land, with the help of the heathen jarls who are yet there. I fight the fight of the cross, therefore, and when I go back to my own land, it will be to sweep away the last worship of Odin and Thor. But the time has not come yet, and his eyes shone strangely. When it comes I will help you, said Edmund, if it may be that I can do so. I know it, and I thank you, but it is my thought that I shall need no help, said the king, while the look on his face was very wondrous, so that I had never seen the like. It minded me of the pictures of Saint Stephen that I saw in a great church here with Abbot Elfric and Edward. Then he spoke of the spread of the faith in Norway, and how that he would be the one who should finish what Olaf Tryggvason, his cousin, had begun, and one might see that he longed for power and kingship only for that work. Long did those 2 warriors talk before they turned to lighter matters, and in the end they planned to ride to Rouen to see the king himself on the next day. But before night fell there came more news with another ship that came alone into the haven. And she was English, bearing messengers from the great Whitman itself. These thanes told Edmund their news, and it was this: that Nut had been hailed as king by the Danish host at Gainsborough, but that the English people begged Ethelred to return to them, promising that a good force should be ready to meet him on his landing. Already the London folk had planned a rising there and in the great towns against the Thingmen, as the Danish paid garrisons were called, and it was likely that this had by this time come about. So at once Edmund went with these thanes to Rouen, and Olaf would have me bide with him till word came from the king as to the next doings. That was a pleasant time to me, for I grew to love Olaf, and he was never willing that I should be far from him. Then, too, I heard many tales of my grandfather Thorol from Ronnie, the old Viking who had fought beside him, and had been with Tryggvason when he was christened in England. And of all Olaf's men I liked best Otter the Black, the Skald, who was but 5 years older than myself, but who had yet seen much fighting with the king both by land and sea. We sang much together, for I was willing to learn from him, and he to teach me. Now of this singing there is one thing that I will set down, for the matter comes into my story again. One day Otter sang the saga of the sword of Hyrvard, how the maiden warrior won it from the grave mound of her father, Angantyr, in spite of terror of the dead hero, and of the unearthly fires. That was a good saga, and when it was ended old Ronnie said, Thorolf had a sword that was won by his father from a chief's grave mound in Venland. It was the most wondrous sword, save only Olaf's Nitir yonder, that I have ever seen. Silver and gold was its hilt, and the blade was wrought in patterns on the steel, and there were runes in gold close to the hilt. He would call it foe's bane, and that in truth was what the sword was. I knew only too well that that sword became my father's in his turn, and now it was lost to me. My father fell with sword foe's bane in his hand, I said sadly. Yet I know that the name was not belied ere he did so. Then the Danes have it, said Ronnie, and it will come back to you. I remembered that Ethelred himself had spoken of the sword, and how I had made his face fall when he heard that it was lost. Nor had I been long at court before I heard words from one thane or another that seemed to say that Edric Strione had made light of our defeat, for some reasons of his own. I must win it back, I said. If there is aught in old sayings, answered Otter, the sword will draw its holder to face you, unless he won it in fair fight hand to hand. Thereat Olaf laughed, and no more was said. But in years to come there were told strange tales of the longing, as it were, of his own sword Nitir to be back at its master's side. So the time went quickly for me, but to Olaf the waiting seemed long before Edmund rode back from Rouen. And with him came those thanes and his half-brother Edward, but Ethelred himself was not with them. He would not go to England, fearing treachery as it seemed, but Edward was to go over and meet the Witmen and speak with them. Yet the thanes said that without the king no force would move. Why does he not go? Said Olaf impatiently. Here is time lost when a sudden blow would win all. Because he is Ethelred the Unready, answered Edmund shortly, for he was very angry at the delay. Then was another waiting, but Edward was very wise though he was so young, being but 12 years old at this time, and he had Elfric the abbot with him, and at last word came from him that all was going well. Then Ethelred made up his mind and listened to Olaf's counsel. Strike at London, he said. We know that the citizens are ever loyal. They had risen, as it seemed, and had slain many of the Thingmen, and Hemming, Thorkel's brother, himself. That had but brought on them hardships and a stronger garrison, while Ethelred wavered and would not come. At last Ethelred gathered what few men would follow him from Normandy and sailed to go to Southampton, and so to Winchester. Richard the Duke gave him a few ships and men enough to man them. Then Olaf, as it was planned, would sail up the Thames in such time as to meet the king's land force at London on a certain day, and thus take the city by a double attack. And Olaf asked that I might sail with him. That Edmund gladly agreed to, saying that we should meet on London Bridge shortly, and so I saw him set out full of hope, and then waited with Olaf for the short time that he would yet stay before sailing. He would not reach the Thames too early lest London should be held in too great force for us, and it was his plan that we should sail up the great river too suddenly for any new Danish force to be gathered. Now on the evening before we sailed Olaf the king was restless, and silent beyond his wont at the feasting before departure, and he seemed to take little pleasure even in the songs of Otter the Skald, though the men praised them loudly. I thought it likely that some foreboding was on him, and that is no good sign before a fight. So presently I spoke to Ronnie, asking him if aught ailed the king. Whereat he answered, smiling. Naught ails him but longing to be sword to sword with these old foes of ours. This is his way, ever. If he were gay as Bjorn the Marshal yonder, I might wonder at him maybe. But presently Olaf rose up and bade Ronny take his place, saying that he would go down to the ships to see that all was well. And then he beckoned me to follow him, and we went down the long hall together. It would seem that this was no new thing that he should leave the feast there, for the little hush that fell as we passed the long tables lasted no long time, and the men seemed not surprised. Indeed, King Olaf had little love for sitting over the ale cup, and no man was more careful to see to all things about his ships and men than he. The great doors closed after us, and we stood in the white moonlight for a moment. The air was cold and sharp after the warmth of the crowded hall. Down in the harbor the water was quiet enough, but outside a fair breeze was blowing from the southwest. "The wind will hold, and will serve us well," said Olaf. "Who of all the Danish hosts will deem that such a wind is bringing fire and sword on them from across the sea?" Then he folded his cloak round him and we went down to the harbor, where the long line of ships lay side by side along the wharf with their bows shoreward. The great dragon stem heads towered over us, shining strangely in the moonlight, and the gentle send of the waves into the harbor made them sway and creak as though they were coming to life. "The dragons are restless as I," he said, looking up at them. "Tomorrow, hungry ones, tomorrow then shall you and I be set free to meet wind and wave and foe again." Then one of the men on watch began to sing, and his song was an old sea stave that had a swing and roll in its rough tune that was like the broken surge of seawater, even while it was time to the fall of oar blades into the surf. One may not say how old those songs are that the seamen sing. "That is the dragon's answer," said the king to me. "Sing, Redwald, and take your part." So when the man came to the part where all should join, I took up the song with him, and then many others of the men joined in, some 5 or 6 in each ship. "That is good," said Olaf, laughing softly. "Here are men whose hearts are light." The man who sang first came now and looked over the high bows of the ship, and his figure was black against the moonlight. "Ho, Master Skald," he cried in his great voice, "now shall you sing the rest. You have put me out of conceit with my own singing. Why are you not at the feast, where I would be if I were not tied here?" "He is keeping the dragons awake," laughed the king. "Nor do I think that even a feast would take you from the ship just as the tide is on the turn." "Maybe not, Lord King," answered the man, lifting his hand in salute. "But the dragons will be wakeful enough, never fear for them." So the king answered back cheerily, and other men came and listened, and so at last he turned away, leaving the men who loved him pleased and the happier for his coming thus. Now I thought that we should have gone back to the hall, but Olaf walked away from the town, going along the shore. The tide was just out, and the flow would soon begin. Soon we lost sight of the last lights from the houses, and still he went on, and I followed him, not speaking, for I knew not what plans he was making. At last we came to a place to which I had not been before, and it was lonely enough. The forest came down to the beach, and the land was low and sheltered between the hills. There the king stayed, sitting down on a fallen tree and resting his chin on his hand, as he looked out over the water with grave eyes that seemed to see far beyond the tossing waves. I rested beside him, and there we bided silent for an hour or more. There was only the sound of the wind in the storm-twisted trees behind us, and of the waves as they broke along the edge of the bare sands, where a few waking sea birds ran and piped unseen by us. Almost had I slept with those well-known sounds in my ears. Then suddenly the king lifted his head, and spoke one word to me. "Listen," he said. I roused, but all that I could hear at first were the sounds that I had forgotten, the song of the wind in the trees, the rush of the breakers, and the cry of the sea birds across the sands. Then my heart began to beat wildly, for out of these sounds, or among them, began to come clearly, and yet more clearly, the sound of the tread of many armed feet, the passing of a mighty host, and with that the thunder of the war song, and the cry of those who bade farewell. And these sounds passed over us and around us, going seawards, then they died away out towards the north, and were gone. Yet still the king listened, and again came the tramp of the armed thousands, and the war song, and the voices of parting, and they passed, and came, and passed yet once more. Then after the third time there was naught but the sound of wind and wave and sea fowl, and I drew closer to Olaf and asked him, "What is this that we hear?" "Wait," he said, and pointed seaward. Then I looked, and I saw all the northern sky glow red as glows the light of a burning town on the low clouds when the host that has fired it looks back on its work. And plain and clear in the silver moonlight against the crimson sky sat the wraith of a king, throned on the sand at the very water's edge, and round him stood shadowy nobles, looking seaward. And even as I saw it, the first wave of the rising tide sent its edge of foam shorewards, and it surged around the kingly feet and sapped the base of the throne, and the stately wraith turned and looked upon the nobles, and was gone. Then faded the red light from the sky, and the waves washed over the place where the throne and court had been, and Olaf rose up and looked in my face. Nor was there fear of what he had seen and heard written in his quiet look. "What is this, my king?" I said, trembling with the fear that comes of things beyond our ken. "It is the fate of England that is falling on her," he said quietly. "Read it me, for I fear what I have heard and seen," I said. "We have heard the going of mighty hosts to England, and we have heard the sound of farewell. But we have heard no shout of victory, or wailing for defeat. Little therefore will be gained or lost by this sailing of ours. Yet all is surely lost if we sail not." Then he ceased, but he had not yet spoken of what we saw, and I waited for his words. Yet still he stood silent, and looked out over the sea, until I was fain to ask him what the vision meant. "Surely it was the wraith of a son of Sweyn that we saw," he said, "but it will be long years ere not bears that likeness, for that was of a man full grown and mighty." Now the reading of this was beyond me, for I have no skill in these matters, as had Olaf. And he said not for a little while, but seemed to ponder over it. "Now I know," said he at last. "What we have seen is the outcome of the going of the hosts to England. There shall be a Danish kingdom built upon sand. Nut shall reign, but his throne shall fall. The wave of English love for England's kings of her own race cannot be stayed." Then I was downcast, for hope that the Danes would be driven from the land had filled all my mind, and I said, "Surely the vision may mean that we shall sweep away the Danish rule as the waves sapped the throne and swept over its place." "Aye, may it be so," answered Olaf. "Often one may read these visions best even as their bodings come to pass. Let us go back. This is a lonesome place, and strange fancies weigh down a man's mind when all he may hear is the wind singing to the surges. Maybe these are but dreams. What matters it if Nut reigns over the old Danelaw as Guthrum reigned, if Ethelred is overlord? It will be again as in Alfred's days, and once more an English king over the English folk, when Nut is gone." So he turned, and led the way back towards the town, and when we saw the lights close at hand, he bade me say naught of this to any man. "We have seen strange things, cousin," he said, taking my arm, "and they will be better untold. You and I may see their meaning hereafter, and maybe shall have a share in their working out. Now let us sleep, and dream only of seeing England again tomorrow."